Elsa and Westeth Halle. Welcome back to the Frithstead Fireside, a setish podcast. I'm Folcweard, and this is episode 8, Reconstructing the Germanic Soul. All right. Life is good. Got to stay positive no matter what it throws at you, right? Everything happens for a reason. Let's begin. So, we're going to delve into the cosmos and the soul, right? And a lot of what I'm going to discuss tonight is taken directly from my upcoming paper that I've written called Reconstructing the Germanic Soul. Life is busy, fate goes ever as she shall, and various things has held up that publishing. So that's where I got the idea. Okay, it's going to be delayed, but I can still get this information out there and put it in a podcast. All right. Um, it's a it's a thick subject, heavy, dense subject, and so I do encourage y'all to get a pen and paper and take notes, or be prepared to give it a re-listen, allow the content to sink in. I'm going to cover several scientific disciplines, which is why I say you may want to listen to this more than once. Like I'm covering historical linguistics, philology, neuroscience, cognitive studies, physics such as quantum theory and quantum mechanics, various biology, embryology, genetics, and then of course the foundation is our lore, because that always has to be the foundation, But before we delve into things, I do want to just retrace our previous fireside chats to show how the previous episodes have been leading up to this episode, and then of course how this episode tonight is going to lead into the next ones, how it all brought us and how they're all connected, right? Which I've intentionally done, because I'm taking y'all on a journey of acquiring knowledge and gaining understanding, before achieving wisdom. Because we need to be the best version of ourselves, and we need to be living our best life, no matter what our situation is, no matter what our age is. We need to be striving towards living our best life, because today is the only thing that we have promised. Tomorrow may not come. So, live in the plan for the future, sure, but live in the moment. Everything is moving us forward toward the betterment of our folk, and that always begins with the betterment of ourselves. And one thing I like to say is that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, but without the one, there are no many. Everything is connected, and everything works together. So, okay, looking back, we began in the ordinary days, and we were learning how to understand and master our dopamine. We looked at the science of motivation and how to harness it for productivity, right? Before, we were learning how to discover how to invest those daily habits into a stable and lasting happiness portfolio, and how when we begin to experience personal transformation and enlightenment, how being red-pilled about how people are and the reality of life, how that naturally forces us to confront some things, that part of the natural reaction, that comes with the cost of clarity, like the element of social isolation that happens, like when boundaries are discovered, and we have to navigate that, and the friction that clarity inevitably brings. And in our last episode, we scaled these inner realities and practices up to the cosmic level, where we mapped the blueprint of original law of Orlog against the experiential unfolding of weird, and the architecture of fate, the root and the branch, right? But today we're going to look at the soul, and we're going to look at creation itself, because those two are going to overlap. But we're going to see and explore how these internal systems that we've been building are actually anchored in the very way our life force was shaped from the beginning. So, okay, we need to set aside the modern mainstream concept of the soul. Most people today uh, have been influenced by centuries of monotheistic thinking, and they treat the soul as a vague, um, monolithic, immortal essence, right? Like a single spark of whatever it is that makes me me, trapped inside a physical body. Now, the Germanics didn't view the soul as a singularity, okay? But they viewed the soul as an integrated architecture of distinct divine gifts. And it's a multi-layered constellation of faculties, each with its own origin, its own function, and its own weight. Now, to explore this, we must ask the central question that anchors our discussion today. What is the soul as seen through the eyes of our ancestors? Now, to understand how we put this together, we have to return to the sources, to the very beginning of our lore. And this also takes us through many disciplines of study, and hence why I spoke about the density of the subject and mentioning and encouraging y'all to take notes and to give this a more than one listen. To give it time to allow the content to sink in. Okay, well, shall we begin? I think we shall. Okay, in the Germanic lore, we know that the gods bestowed upon the first humans, Osk and Embla, a series of gifts, which together endowed them with life, gave them identity and consciousness. Now, according to Waluspa 17 and 18, they were found lifeless and without orlog until three brother gods, the sons of Bor, breathed into them the vital forces that made them fully human. So we'll begin with the Allfather, whom the Norse called Odin. Uh, Today it's been anglicized as Odin. The English speakers um, will tend to say Woden. Of course, Woden, think of Wednesday. That means the day of Woden. But Woden gave the gift of Ond, and Ond is the sacred breath, the animating spirit of life. Ond is the force that enters the lungs and sets the being in motion. Without it, the body remains a lifeless vessel. Now, next we have Hunir Way, and he granted Other. So Other represents thought, intellect, and emotional depth. It's the cognitive engine, the faculty of the mind, the formative awareness that allows us to reason, to remember, and to seek meaning beyond mere biological function, right? And then we have Lodorwili, and he shaped their physical form. He gifted them law. And law is the blood, that vital warmth that circulates life, and it contains the blueprints of our heritage, our DNA. Uh, the one thing that is, if anyone wants, going to look up these terms, when you look up law, it translates to sea or ocean, but that's just a poetic usage to refer to our blood. So Luther gave the gift also of Lati, and that's one's manner, the bearing and sound or voice. And finally, he gave what's called Liturgoda. Now, Liturgoda is sometimes interpreted as goodly countenance, or divine appearance, or hue. And when I say hue, I mean as color, right? But it functions as a subtler spiritual body that shapes the outward form and directly reflects the inner condition of the person. Now, when you look closely at these attributes, a distinct structure emerges. Okay, the higher gifts of Uther and Und and Lither form the invisible essence of a person, what people today might refer to as the soul, our spirit with its thought and our personality. Yet the ancestors didn't view these as isolated and independent attributes. The other gifts, they served as the necessary vehicles through which this invisible essence was embodied, expressed, and made manifest in the world. And and these gifts aren't merely ingredients to make us a functional biological being. They're ontological in nature, which that is just the nature of existence. Okay. They constitute the very foundation of being. And it's through these gifts that Osk and Embla were not only animated, but they were individuated. They were made capable of thought and emotion and self-expression. And they were given names and clothed and placed in Midgard, the middle yard that we call Earth. So if we look deeper into Other, we see that it's treated as a single faculty. Yet it in and of itself has multiple expressions that unfold into two distinct divine faculties. Huger, the rational and structuring mind, and Muner, the emotive longing that seeks meaning and connection, as well as memory. But because memory and that longing and search for meaning, that's all tied together. Can't have one without the other. Other, and that's the essence of creative force, containing our individuating identity, our ego, our inspiration, right? And when Other is united with Owned, it sparks life into us and gives rise to cognition, to longing, desire, memory, and that inspiration to grow beyond mere survival and towards the search for purpose and meaning. The gods didn't impart arbitrary traits, but they embedded spiritual and metaphysical dimensions into mankind. Each gift is an active divine principle that's woven into the fabric of Orlog and the very structure of ordered existence, ensuring that man is connected to the gods and cosmologically integrated into the world tree Yggdrasil through the primal creative elements. And we're going to get to that point where we're going to talk about those creative elements. Going back to the source. Now, while the sources do not explicitly state the cosmological origin of each divine gift, I want to advance a theoretical theological reconstruction to to advance a credible and logical assertion. Okay, but it's based off the sources, and I'm saying that because I'm not here saying 100% everything is 100% attested in the lore. No. And when you're doing theological reconstruction, you take what's in the sources, and then there might be some missing gaps here and there. And this is with every single religion on the planet. And you use that in order to reconstruct and present um, theories. Now, a theory, it needs to be said, is not just an opinion, because a theory is something that is backed by sources, where you build a case, you build an argument, something that has substance. So, anyway, I'm just digressing here, but I just want to make that clear. And now, but because this is the point where our discussion goes deeper. Where did the gods get these gifts? How did they create them? We can envision the gods drawing these gifts directly from the primal wells, from the essence of the cosmos. Owned our breath and life from Hvergelmir's primordial waters. Other, our mind, will, and order and awareness from Mimersbrunner. And Liturgotha, that our inner hue and form from Sogdalir. Now, when the Liturgotha from Sogdalir hypothesized here as its generative source, if you will, the point of formative transformation. All right. And this goes back to the fire and the ice that we see in the lore. But I'll continue to get into it. Um, to be clear, okay, and I'm trying not to go too fast here, um, because there's a lot here. To be clear, these are interpretive correspondences rather than direct attested claims from the text, but they do illustrate how in the Germanic tradition the soul was neither an afterthought nor a temporary spark, but a deliberate usage of divine forces anchoring us within an ordered and living cosmos. Okay. And the complexity of the soul architecture becomes clearer when we look at how it operates within the spiritual and fated realms through the roles of Hamingia and Hammer. Now, our Hamingia, that's our personal luck, our guardian spirit that's assigned to us at birth. Now, this female protector, also known across the lore as Filgia, she's referred to as a Dramkona, Norn, Gipta, and Dis. Dis is a goddess, and generally, in when you're reading the lore, if it's lowercase, that's one that's like a female, could be like a female, the female Filgia or a female ancestor, whereas capitalized Dis is referring to the goddesses. Um, but anyhow, she follows us through life, and ultimately she acts to witness for us at the hellthing after death. And then we have the Hummer, and that's the guise or the shape, the form that allows transformation and spiritual projection. Now, together, these forces, nurtured through deliberate action, legacy, and fate, reflect the ancient Germanic understanding of the self. The soul is a living thread connecting us to the gods, connecting us to our world and to existence itself. And that weaves the spiritual, physical, and fated realms into a single unified existence. And in essence, the layout of what makes us us. So, okay, now Hammer. Rooted Hammer's rooted in the Old Norse word for skin or shape. And Hammer refers not only to our physical form, but to our spiritual outer layer. And this layer is dynamic, it's energetic. Um, that is, it can be altered, assumed, or cast forth through deliberate will, through magic, or even through raw emotional intensity. Now, our forebears left proof of this framework, within the sagas. Now, expressions such as vixlalitum, which means to exchange appearance, and then we have skipta honmum, which means to change one's shape. These terms show up in accounts detailing spiritual transformation or the journeying of the soul. Now, consider the Ynglinga saga, okay, where Woden is recorded laying down as if dead while his Hammer takes flight in the form of animals to accomplish his willed deeds in the distant lands. Now, likewise, in the Walsunga saga, Signy and a Seid Kona, they exchange their outer forms, right? Now, they successfully deceive the king, yet their inner selves remain entirely unaltered. So, So, what do these traditional accounts teach us? They suggest that Homer and Liter can be treated as two interwoven aspects of a divine endowment, right? Liter is what we call the soul's inerrant form and moral hue, while when projected or manifested, it's called the Homer. Now, in the phenomena of soul travel, these manifestations are often described as occurring by more than a force of our will. The projecting soul is borne outward with the Philgia, together with the combined movement of our Huger and Muner beyond the physical body. Now, the Hammer, therefore, is not an illusion. It's not a costume or just a physical disguise. Okay, it's a projectable and externalized aspect of the soul through which a person is expressed or encountered, and it's intimately tied to Liter, that inner form gifted to us by Luther really, but it's organized and directed by Other, the conscious will. Now, according to Cleesby and Vicfuson's dictionary, which is one of the top sources when you're looking into the Old Norse language, terms like skipta hunum and hamramr, they appear frequently throughout the Old Norse poetry and the sagas, uh, and they're described specifically as in regards to soul activity. Um, Victor Riedberry observed that the hammer arises naturally from the liter and functioning as its outward projection. So they're you can see how they're all interconnected, and they build upon each other and work together. Everything is connected. It's how should I word this? Okay, it's best understood as a spiritually resonant sheath. Okay, it's liminal, highly expressive, and it's responsive to both your character as well as your inner condition, and allowing the soul to act, to travel, or to appear beyond the confines of our body. Okay, so in looking at the gifts which come together to form what we call the soul, let's turn our attention to the word soul. All right. Now, the first thing that needs to be considered, however, is that when looking at the gifts of the God, the modern word soul, it really isn't truly sufficient in describing all of these gifts, because that's not, we're not taught that growing up. Our society doesn't think in those terms, unfortunately. So we have to relearn how to think like our ancestors in order to express the the faith today. That's not to copy, but of course not, but to build off of. In modern times, the heavy influence of mono theistic and multicultural creeds, philosophy, modes of thought, all of that, it just leads one to view the soul as a vague monolithic entity, right? But again, the ancient Germanic folk simply didn't think that way, and that begs the question: where did the word soul come from, and what did the word soul originally mean? So we'll get into a little bit of word history, a little bit of linguistics, um, before we go deeper into the sciences. Our modern word soul comes directly from the Anglo-Saxon word soul, but long before it ever appeared in Old English, we can trace its family tree all the way back to an older language called Proto-Germanic, and that's where it was Sawalu. And going back even further in history, it comes from the Proto-Germanic word Sawalo. Now, to find the absolute deepest roots of this word in ancient times, we have to look back thousands of years to the Proto-Indo-European language, which is the mother language that gave birth to most European languages today. And even though this word has a very long history, the way people used it shifted completely in both meaning and purpose over time. Now, originally, the word soul was directly connected to the native beliefs of the Germanic people. And those native beliefs were not simple. They included a highly complex, multi-layered understanding of what it means to be alive and exist as a human being. But when early Christian missionaries adopted the word, they started a major process of simplification and repurposing. They took a big, complex idea with lots of moving parts, and then they flattened it down into something simpler to help teach their own lessons. Now, before Christianity ever arrived, the Germanic people almost certainly had this word in their everyday vocabulary. But when the new faith came along, the word was forced to change and adapt into a completely different context so that it could fit into a foreign way of thinking. And by looking closely at the history of language, we can peel back the changes like layers of an onion. We can uncover exactly how the concept transformed over the centuries, and we can make a true attempt to rediscover its original proper context within the ancestral Germanic worldview. Now, evidence from ancient records show that Germanic words for soul eventually became standardized in church texts to describe the immortal soul as a single everlasting spirit. Yet the fact that nearly identical versions of this word show up across many Germanic languages proves that the word held real meaning long before Christianity arrived. And we can see this when we look at how these related words, called cognates, survived across the different ancient Germanic dialects. The Goths said Saiwala, the Old Saxons, Sewala, the Old Frisians said Sele, the Old Low Germans, Sela or Sila, the Old High Germans, Sela or Sula, and the Norsemen said Sal or Sala. Though it is believed that the Norse borrowed the word from the Saxons, but nevertheless, they still understood the word and used it. But before Christianity came along, Germanic spiritual ideas were deeply rooted in a broad, layered view of the self rather than just a single piece. And we see this clearly in the specific words used for the gifts given by the gods to the first humans. Ond, which means breath or spirit. Other, inspiration and divine madness. Law, the motion, the bodily warmth, the blood. Lati, the manner of behavior. Litrogotha, the divine hue or inner presence, right? All of these things. Our ancestors, but they also used other everyday words connected directly to the inner workings of a person. They used Huger, mind and thought, Mooner, memory, longing, and Hammer, that skin, that spiritual shape or form that a person can put on or take off, changing their appearance. And with the Hummer, by it's usually seen by looking into the eyes, which stays the same no matter what form is being taken. They do say, the eyes are the window to the soul, right? Very a lot of truth to that. But all this evidence points to a single conclusion. Okay, our forebears, our ancestors believed in a distributed multi-part understanding of personal essence rather than just a singularity. And because of this, the spiritual structure described in the creation account of Ask and Embla, it reflects the layered metaphysical origins. The higher gifts of Ond, Other, and Litogotha, um, rooted deep in the creative realms of the cosmos, right? And then in the lower gifts of La and Lati, which are drawn from regular temporal physical existence. But it's highly likely, however, that the Germanic peoples originally began using the word Sawol and its related forms to sum up these parts into a more unified concept. A change that was probably sparked by meeting and trading with people who held foreign beliefs. It's a well-known fact in language history that speech simplifies for the sake of language and communication, when differing cultures collide. When we saw this exact same dynamic play out uh, in the rapid shaking up and evolution of the English language, uh, under the heavy pressure time that we know of as the Anglo-Saxon Danelaw era. But after the conversion, Christianity, um, it had an intense focus on the importance of the individual person, um, which is on a side note, which is where we get the hyper individualism that we have today, that's seen in the modern, global society that we live in. But that focus on the individual, it may have sped up the formal use and expansion of the word, but its very existence in pre-Christian languages prove that the core idea was never a completely foreign concept to our folk. So while the church certainly shaped its deeper religious meaning to fit, a brand new cultural framework, soul was was likely already living in the native vocabulary as a trusted word to describe the animating force or true essence of a being, whether they meant it, in part, a few of those things, or as a whole. Because it very well could have been a word that referred to all of those things, like the concept, right? Now, before Christianity came along, the word soul, didn't mean an invisible spirit that goes to heaven or hell, or rather, it meant the basic physical force that gave us life or our living breath. Uh, Chances are, when you look into linguistic history, that's the likely original meaning. But of course, when you're dealing with language, there's a lot of speculation, and so you have to understand that. Um, a lot of a lot of linguistic reconstruction is theoretical. Okay, and again, it's based off sources, and the linguistic theories are valid, and so they're not just opinions, as I was stating earlier. But the word soul was used almost exactly like other Old English words, such as "fenroch," which means life. You have "ghost," which means spirit, and then you have "leaf," which simply means life, right? And in these older native forms, the soul was all about your actual breathing and the physical force that keeps you moving. Um, Various definitions relating to your life. But as the church took over, the word was shifted to mean that immortal spirit that is totally separate from your physical body, to match the foreign Latin and Greek concepts. And we can find proof of this in uh, the older native meaning in the very first English translations of the Bible. In the ancient Gospel of Luke, we there's two important sentences that I'll read. Okay, in the first, it says, "On tisa nishtehia fekathina sawala framte," and that translates to, "This night they shall take your soul from you." Now, right after that, it says, "Seu Saul usma thonese lichama," and that translates to, "The soul is more than the body." Now, these two lines are important because they show that our ancestors saw the soul as something real living inside a person, but they also knew that it was capable of leaving the physical body. Now, Another example is found in the Kentish Gospels of Matthew, and that text describes a person's life by using a very unique double phrasing, stating "his sole life." But the full line translates to "the Son of Man came to give his soul life as a ransom for many." Now, when we look at the grammar, it can teach us a lot. The word sole acts as a specific pointer that changes the meaning of the word leaf or life. And it explains exactly what kind of life was being talked about. It was his soul's life, and meaning the essential inner life force that made him who he was. And this proves that back then, Saul was not just a narrow church word yet. It was still a big, broad word that mixed together, that with the idea of regular daily life. That is, meaning your vital self and your living breath. But the phrase "his sole life," his soul's life, that kind of acts like a bridge between two totally different ideas. It bridges the original native understanding of life, which was a collection of different moving forces working together, and the Christian view of the soul as a single immortal spirit. Now, because of this, writing "sole life" is not just repeating the same word twice. It is a deeply layered expression, and it was shaped by native beliefs, but also influenced by the foreign Latin and Greek ideas, which did view the soul as a single, immortal thing that had nothing to do with the flesh. Now, the older Germanic Saul was different because it was a spread out force tied to your breath, your daily life, and your physical existence, right? Now, these old descriptions, they sound like the Old Norse word "owned," which is the vital breath given to the first humans by the gods, as recorded in Uspa. And this really does reinforce the original native idea that the soul is a living, present force that you use while you're alive, rather than just something that happens to you after you die, right? Now, there's an old sermon called the Blickling Homily, um, and that it helps to explain this. It tells us that even though the soul is invisible, it is the exact force that makes the physical body move and do things. When a person dies, the soul separates from the body and it leaves behind a completely empty shell, leaving the body it's worded like as a stone or as a tree, immovable. Now, eventually, as England converted to Christianity, the word Saul took on a heavier church-focused meaning, and there's an old text by a writer named Boethius, excuse me, and we read "Mona sole sint ontalice an ecce," and that means the souls of men are undying and eternal. And this was a major shift in thinking. The word stopped meaning vital breath and started meaning an immortal spirit. What we get in the end is a concept suspended directly between two different worlds. The original Germanic breath of life and the Christian soul wait as a one single entity waiting judgment. And when we look through these old texts, you know, we don't see a massive contradiction, but a steady line of history changing through small, subtle interpretations and reinterpretations. So, and long story short, when you're looking at the etymology, the history of the word, you can see how the Germanics meant it one way, and then when Christianity came in, the definition was changed in order to mean something else. Because they came in and they wanted to change the worldview, change the way we thought. But anyhow, let's move on. Before we look closer into the theological and mythological elements of the soul, um, let's take a quick look at where the word came from thousands of years ago. Okay, scientists who study the history of words use a method that's called historical linguistics. And they compare different languages to see how they changed over time, and they use special rules to figure out what was original, um, what what the original and ancient words used to be. Now, again, even though these ancient words are educated guesses, they're highly likely to be correct. Um, it's a pretty thorough science, but they help us to discover not just how languages are related, but also how the ancient people shared the same cultural and spiritual ideas. So the oldest Germanic word for soul was Saiwalo, and that can be traced back to a couple of different ancient roots, right? You know, one idea, which is brought up by a language expert named Weisweiler in 1940, um, he connected the word for soul to an old word for the sea or the ocean, which was Saiwis. And he spoke of an ancient belief that sacred lakes were special places where the spirits of the dead rested and where unborn babies waited to be born. And really, when you think of this, this idea aligns with the wells of the underworld in Germanic lore, and it also connects to an old belief from the nearby Sami people, who talked about a special underworld lake called Savie, and they believed that this lake had a double bottom and was the home of the dead. And that's probably where Weisweiler got his idea from. And to add even more weight to this connection, the word Savier had a double meaning because it was also the word for guardian or helping spirits. You know, another idea brought up by a German scholar named Fritz Mesger in 1968. Now he points to a different direction. Okay, he connected the word for soul to two ancient word roots: "soi," which means self, and "wallow," which means choice or will. And that's suggesting not a fixed definition of the soul, but a conceptual thread. One that illuminates how will and identity and consciousness may have been understood as an emerging interplay of the animating forces, right? Now, by studying word histories this way, okay, we may not get a final definition of the soul, but instead it does help us trace the path of how ancient people first tried to explain the inner essence of being a person. These word histories show just how important the concept of the soul was to our early ancestors. And these when you're looking into it, linguistics, it really helps when you're building an argument, when you're building a theory, uh, to provide supportive structure. Now, looking at the history of the word, which we call etymology, and it shows us how the word grew and what other ideas it hung out with over time, if you will. You know, like today, modern sciences can describe these same internal patterns in a way that a modern reader will easily recognize, right? Even if science doesn't talk about the spiritual side of a tradition. But with that boundary in mind, we can look at the data and ask a question: Does the soul, do the soul functions, if you will, described by our ancestors, do they match up with, say, modern brain science or cognitive studies that we see today? And when we ask that question, let's back up just a second. And if we look at odor as a force that operates deep below our conscious awareness, that the sparking of thoughts inside our physical body, which is animated by the living breath of Ond, then we can start to understand that the soul is not just a vague idea, but it's a real structured system made of different parts working together. Now, modern brain science shows that our thoughts and choices actually start working unconsciously in the brain before we even realize we're thinking them. And this aligns perfectly with the idea that Orlog is already at work inside us, shaping our path before we can even recognize it, or before we can even attempt to control or even try to manipulate it, right? But, so instead of making the soul seem less important, I contend that this science actually highlights its inner structure as a sacred ancient process that's unfolding from deep within us. And in this ancient Germanic view, the soul is not the creator of life, but it acts as its mediator and its conductor. And it's formed from the basic building blocks of Oder, Ond, and Lether Goda, the gifts of the brother gods. So what we call soul is the gifts of the gods. And I can't see any other way around that. And then these gifts are all ruled by Orlog, the original law of the universe. Now, these gifts were given to us by the gods, and not to make us completely independent, but to give us tools to function within the sacred pattern of life. We're not totally free in the modern lawless sense. Instead, we're built to live with real meaning inside the great web of weird, playing out a specific role that has been shaped for us. Now, the soul works by channeling these divine gifts into our daily experiences, turning what is hidden and invisible into things that are visible and personal. It lets us experience life not as bored people just watching nature pass by, but as active participants who are naturally part of the world's order and rhythm. The true goal of the soul is not to make up a fake identity from nothing, but is to express and carry out what has been divinely woven right into our being. Now, this expression happens through an essential process, harmonizing your breath with your thoughts, your inner impulses with your outward form, and your inner pattern with your daily actions. And this means the alive breath of owned must join together with the inspired thoughts and awareness of other, so that we are not just biological robots, but consciously directed and participatory human beings. And likewise, law, the blood carrying warmth and life through the body must be shaped and shown through your physical form, or Hammer and your behavior, or Lati. This ensures that the soul's inner energy is physically felt in your actions and presence, because blood acts as the moving current of life. Law allows the divine gifts to travel through us, making the soul active in the real world. Now, finally, your inner spiritual design, right? The bright radiance of your moral essence that's called Liter Gotha, and how it's shaped by Orlog. And it projects outward through your Hammer and shows up in your actions, making your true character of your soul visible for people to see. And this is exactly how the soul completes its sacred job, not by inventing its own meaning, but by bringing the intentions of the gods into physical form through a life of total harmony. So, by doing this, the soul becomes the living thread that makes Orlog visible in real time. To live the right way means to bring out that inner design with clarity and dignity, fulfilling the true purpose written right into the structure of who you are. Now, modern neuroscience, it can help us explain how our thoughts and our patterns work, right? But our religion gives us the actual accounts of where we come from and how the soul is built. And with that boundary in place, we have to start at the absolute beginning. Again, as I progress, I'm continuing to go back and go back and go back some more, just tracing back the origin of the origin of the origin. And so we have to now go to a place called Genungagap. And to understand the soul in the ancient Germanic worldview, we have to understand Genungagap as a massive space filled with hidden resting potential where the creation of the universe starts because two opposites come into contact with each other. The Lord doesn't say Genungagap was just nothing. Instead, it's described as a resting energy that eventually turns into an ordered universe. Okay. And it does this through a specific step-by-step sequence. Now, for a reader today, thinking of a what's called a quantum vacuum is helpful, but a limited comparison. Okay. But it does help us picture a space that is already filled with energy fields rather than just being completely empty space. Okay, so bear with me as I walk through this. Okay, creation didn't just happen out of nothing. It happened by bringing order to two interacting extremes. And this was an encounter between two existing poles, Sogdalir and Niflheim, which they finally met and they balanced out at a center point where the sacred well of Mimasbrunner now stands, which is where Genungagap used to be. Now, in this cosmic view, the energy inside Genungagap, it couldn't organize itself. Okay, it required Other, which acts as the ordering catalyst that forces raw energy to transform into a structured reality. Without Other, Gap would have stayed completely still and balanced forever. It'd be stuck in a state of unreality, if you will, like where structure could never emerge and potential could never show up. Simply put, Gap was not wild chaos, but it was not perfect order. It was just pure potential waiting for action. Now, we can compare this to Nikola Tesla's idea of the ether. Now, he described the ether as a substance filling out all of space that creates structured matter, but only when an initiating force acts upon it. Okay. Now, Tesla compared this life-giving force to the Hindu concept of prana. Now, while these comparisons are interesting, that just mind you, they're just helpful ways to look at the topic. Not being actual proof of the Germanic lore. It's just using comparisons, using examples in order to try to gain an understanding. So, in the ancestral accounts, Other is the exact ordering principle that starts structure inside Gap and sets the great unfolding of life into motion. But Other is much more than an abstract creative force. It's the gift of a mind and formative awareness, right? And along with it, Owned is given as a gift of breath and life. So these original gifts given to the first humans, Ascanembla, and they're still passed down to us today through the fruits of the world tree Yggdrasil. Now, this continuous passing of Other, shows that what we call the soul is not just some extra piece added onto life from the outside, but it's a natural part of the existence itself inside the cosmic design, and that's shaped by the exact same forces that built the universe. Yet even Other cannot just do whatever it wants. It is still bound by the original law that rules over everything that exists now and everything that will ever be. the original law of what we call orlog. And orlog sets up the strict rules for how energy and matter and human awareness interact with each other. The basic laws that we describe in modern physics align with this framework, even though science, of course, doesn't go into the spiritual side of things. But looking at it through a certain perspective, you can read between the lines and you can see this. I hope you can see this. You know, um, Orlog is not a force of directed will making choices. Orlog is a neutral principle that ensures everything moving inside Gununga Gap acts according to a built-in and unchangeable order. The order of Orlog. Um, Now, modern physics can only measure and describe its measurable regularities, right? But in this way, Other is the active moving impulse inside a universe that has already had its rules determined by Orlog. And this links the creation of the vast universe to the very same processes and laws that rule over our human soul. Now, when Other acted upon Gunungagat, the vast expanse of hidden potential, it kicked off the structure unfolding of life. And it did this by disturbing the balance. And this disturbance forced the existing forces of heat and cold to meet and interact inside Gunungagat. Now, this meeting was world forming, and it became the foundation of all creation. So, to picture how this material moved, uh, think of frozen rivers and frost pressing outward from the cold north, while sparks and embers drifted in from the hot south. Go back to our lore. You know, Other is not the conveyor belt moving through these pieces, but instead is the ordering catalyst that takes an encounter that was already happening and makes it productive and world forming. And these forces were not wild or random, but they reflected a, a deep they a, a deep and direct meeting between pre-existing extremes. Okay, now Other did not create the heat and cold, but it forces their meeting inside Gap to build a world, setting up the basic framework for everything that followed. Right. So Dalir in the south, that's the place of consuming heat and constant transformation. And it represents expansive energy, entropy, and motion, which is the exact principle that drives all change. Now, in contrast, Niflheim is in the northern extreme of freezing condensation and stillness. And it acts as the stabilizing counterforce that allows physical form to hold together. Now, ruled completely by Orlog, the built-in order of all becoming, these two realms stand as the very first named extremes in the cosmos. And within them, the ordering of the universe unfolds, transforming the boundless potential of Gununga into an organized whole. Now, science, describes high energy states and stabilizing conditions as a key part of how physical structures emerge. Um, Dollar mirrors the explosive outward transformation, while Nibelheim reflects the quiet, stabilizing conditions allowing structures to form. Okay, their interaction at the center of the gap was definitely not wild chaos, but a process ruled by a fundamental law where a stable world emerges through physical limits and direct encounters. Now, okay, so let's go into those. Okay, from the spring of Hvurgamir flowed the Elevagar, and these are the cosmic rivers. And these icy waters acted like a natural bridge between raw energy and solid substance, joining constant change and stillness together. And And through their interaction, the hot realm of Sogdalir and the freezing realm of Nibelheim created the steady building blocks that shaped the entire universe. Heat and cold were not like enemies fighting a random battle, but were more like the actual architects of our order reality. And they made sure that life didn't just flash into existence for a second and disappear, but instead grew with a real purpose because it followed a reliable law. Now, as the fields of heat and cold intensified inside Ginnungagap, it became clear that the raw, the untamed energy, that by itself was not enough to create a lasting world. Energy without order is chaotic.
and cannot keep itself alive without stabilization. Just like physical systems transition through stabilizing phases before a structure can emerge, the cosmos require regulators. Orlog produced these regulators in the form of wells, or springs of existence, introducing perfect balance and direction to the folding universe. The very first of these stabilizing forces rose up in the realm of hell, known as the Well of Ertherbrunner. Now, Ertherbrunner carries the continuous recycling and transformation of energy and time, and this ensures that life unfolds in structured and repeating cycles rather than melting away into random energy fields. As as the cosmic seat where Orlog lives as ancient law and Weird has met as its unfolding path, Ertherburner rules over the dynamic balance between change and stillness, keeping life from getting stuck, all the while maintaining order. Just like physics says that energy is never lost but simply reshaped and treats time as tied to cause and effect rather than a straight line, Ertherburner serves as the mechanism that channels the unfolding of Weird, and it guides the eternal flow of becoming in total agreement with Orlog, the baseline law of reality. Now, science can describe these regular habits, but it cannot explain the spiritual cause behind them. So, our model suggests that a person's inner hue, their liter, has its roots in Sogdalir.
The shaping and polishing of that liter over time is then in turn heavily influenced by Ertherbrunner because it contains Orlog. And Ertherbrunner guides not just your overall fate, but the visible look of your moral and your spiritual character. Now, the northern counterpart to this well is Hvergelmir, the roaring cauldron in Nibelhel. Now, the Elevagar rivers, okay, they rushed outward from it, and they, carrying the force of freezing condensation and structure. And as these icy rivers extended into Ginnungagap, they froze into thick layers of rime, building the very first physical foundation of the universe. And this was a major cosmic transition where potential solidified into real form. Now, this area of the lore, matches what science calls phase transitions, like how water freezes into solid ice. If energy is left unchecked, it just wastes away into total disorder. But when it's guided through stabilizing conditions, it comes together into ordered structures. So, the interaction between Hel, Nibelheim, and these cosmic wells made sure that the forces of change and stability could live together, letting the universe take shape without crashing back into total disorder.
At the heart of existence, right where the empty void of Ginnungagap used to be, a powerful harmonizing force rose up between the realms of Hel and Niflhel, namely Mimsbrunner, the Well of Wisdom. And this marked the absolute final stage in building the structure of the cosmos. and it made sure that creation was not just ordered, but also completely self sustaining and full of purpose. See, before this well showed up, raw energy and opposing forces were clashing in a state of chaos. But now they finally had perfect order and balance, which allowed stable, evolving worlds to form.
The way that Other acted upon Gap sparked the world-forming meeting between the pre-existing forces of heat and cold. And 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 as the universe stabilized, the three cosmic wells stood firm as the regulators, and each well serving its own distinct role in the continuous structuring of reality. So again, we have Erdebrunner, which arose as the sacred seat where Orlog is measured out as it unfolds into real life. We have Haverglamir, which was already there as the original source of all cosmic waters, and that can be understood as carrying the very essence of Ond, pouring out and scattering the animated life force across creation. And then Mimesbrunner arose as the exact point of convergence where Other and Ond were harmonized together to create a self-sustaining order. Now, because of this, Mimesbrunner stands right in the center where Gap once was, while Erdebrunner and Havergamir stand firm as the southern and northern pillars inside of this exact same cosmic system. Now, the unique waters of Mimesbrunner, they mix together with Uther, the creative force that brings structure, order, self-awareness, into existence, and Ond, the life force that breathes animation into creation. You know, this makes it the ultimate cosmic stabilizer, right? It harmonizes the creative spark of Other with the life-giving essence of Ond, and turning everything into a self-regulating, evolving universe. You know, sticking with the scientific terms, to try to help y'all understand, this is very similar to how self-regulation works in nature. Hold on one second. Okay, so in scientific terms, as I was saying, this is very similar to how self-regulation works in nature. It works like stabilizing feedback loops that allow complex systems to keep order while they adapt and change. Like, for example, hurricanes. They naturally form to release trapped excess heat to cool the planet when global temperatures are rising. Or how your own body manages its water levels, triggering a thirst response when you're dehydrated, and turning that thirst off the moment that you do hydrate. Cause and effect, if you will. But the actual formation of this well was very much like a phase transition in physics, when extreme heat and extreme cold collide under the right conditions, and they don't just smash each other up in an unpredictable mess, but instead the collision causes matter to suddenly shift into a brand new and completely stable form. Like, to make this process easy to understand, again, think of how ice forms. When freezing cold air meets liquid water inside of a container, then they collide. Now, instead of just making a messy splash, the cold pushes the water until it suddenly shifts into a solid block of ice. Now, in science, this sudden shift is called phase transition, and it proves a major rule of the universe. You can get a steady, orderly structure whenever two opposite forces bump into each other under the right conditions. And this shows us how the whole universe works. To change and grow, the world needs wild, high pressured extremes like intense heat, freezing cold, energy, instability. These heavy pressures act like an engine, pushing new transformation forward, but the engine needs brakes. Why? Because if not, it'll spin out of control. So at the exact same time, the universe also needs a stabilizing order, like strict rules, tight boundaries, measurements. And this quiet order acts like a cage that catches the wild energy and shaping it so the final results are long lasting, steady, and safe enough for living things to live in. Now, go back to what I was saying just a little bit ago. A little bit of repetition here. Looking back into the lore, the Jotnar or the giants, they can be understood as representations of these heavy boundary pressures. The how should I put it? The destabilizing forces of chaos, right? And but this does not mean that the Jotnar are literally, heat itself, or that the the hot realm of Dahlia is identical to the giants. No, but instead, it's a structural comparison. The Jotnar represent the wild, high variant boundary pressures, that force change to happen in the universe. Yet, even these wild forces must unfold under the watchful measure of Orlog. Meanwhile, the gods and later on mankind, represent the stabilized, rule governed patterns, these steady patterns that come together. They all come together because of Orlok. And this baseline of rules produces reliable, steady conditions where complex human life can actually survive and endure. Now, it's important to say here, okay, that in pointing out that these destabilizing forces are structurally necessary for the universe, that doesn't mean we worship or support them. No. In our tradition, these wild forces, are treated as conditions that must be strictly bound and managed, rather than things we should look for or to copy or to venerate, because we definitely do not at all in any way support or condone going after the chaotic. And our ancestors did not either. Now, this exact balancing act happened when the icy rivers of the Elevagar spread outward and met the intense heat blowing in from Sogdalir. But instead of blowing each other up in total destruction, these opposite forces interacted in a highly organized way. And this led directly to the establishment of that central well, Mimersbrunner. Now, within the three sacred wells, with them being firmly in position, all right, the universe evolved from a chaotic battlefield of opposing forces into a completely interconnected system, with Orlog maintaining the baseline foundation of order, while new creation and transformation was unfolding in a balanced way in order to actually be. So together, these three wells built the cosmic foundation for all of life, and they successfully prevented the universe from either crashing down into wild chaos or getting completely frozen or stuck in place. So we're going to move on from this. All right. Um, the wells did not just shape the cosmos, but they also laid down the structural foundation for the next massive emergence, Yggdrasil, the world tree. So, building directly upon the foundation of Gap as the empty void of hidden potential, and using Uther as the active catalyst that brought order to creation, we can now turn to the rise of Yggdrasil. And bear with me here as we continue. We will be circling all of this back into the soul, because again, it's all interconnected. The world tree functions as the great vertical axis that organizes and keeps existence alive. Okay. Just like regular life unfolds slowly, step by step, rather than just popping up out of nowhere, cosmic life required a distinct catalyst to transform that hidden, though now balanced, energy into a productive order. This necessary catalyst is described in our lore as a golden seed, and it marks the exact moment when Uther, that ancient creative force, was ignited directly inside the waters of Mimersburger. And that ignition set up the perfect conditions for Yggdrasil to finally take root. From this direct meeting of spiritual force and physical substance, the world tree sprang forth, extending its branches into a massive network that tightly binds the entire fabric of reality together. Now, as the great vertical axis spanning from the home of the gods, Asgard, all the way down to our world, Midgard, and deep into the underworld of Jormungandr below, you know, Yggdrasil functions as the literal embodiment of the entire cosmos. So let's get in a little bit deeper into Yggdrasil. All right. In Gefangenen 15, Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, is described as having three roots, reaching into distinct realms. One among the gods, the Aza, one among the frost giants, and one in the Niflhel, the realm of death and cold. Yet, as Victor Reedbury demonstrates in his investigation into Germanic mythology, which I strongly suggest everyone read, there's a more accurate picture that emerges when we look at the poetic sources as a whole. And again, this is looking at primary sources versus secondary sources, because we need to understand that Gefangenen, written by Snorri, is a secondary source, but the poetic Edda, the poems in there, they're the primary sources. And in his research, he shows that all three routes descend into the lower world, not the way Snorri described. And they're arranged along a north to south axis. The northern route stands over Hvergelmir's cold waters and spreads over Niflhel, which is situated in the north of Hvergelmir, the icy spring in Niflheim that's associated with death and punishment and inhabited by the Hrimthursar. Okay, and then there's the central route is watered by Mimir's fountain, and that spreads over the land where Mimir's Grove is located. Now, in Mimir's Grove live Leif and Leifthresir and their offspring, who are fated to repopulate the regenerated Earth in the next cycle. But then we have the southern route, which reaches the warm waters of Erlenbrunner, the well of fate and divine law beneath the Thingstead of the gods. Now, for that primary source, look at Grimnismal 31. But this vertical arrangement, like I said, taken from primary sources, that reflects a more coherent and symbolically integrated cosmology than the false felled tree scheme presented by Snorri Sturluson and Gefangenen. Because when you look at the primary sources, the world tree is upright, it's standing tall, whereas when you look at Snorri's, it's chopped down. And that's a subtlety that a lot of people are unaware of. Another reason to bear in mind how Snorri is a secondary source. But within this threshold or threefold, root structure of Yggdrasil, the golden seed theory becomes cosmologically meaningful. Now, though not explicitly stated in the Germanic texts, the golden seed, as posited by Victor Reidbury, it emerges from comparative Indo-European studies, and it's one of the methodologies in the hierarchy of the epic method. Now, he recognized that Yggdrasil, much like the Rig Vedic golden womb or the Zoroastrianism white hometry, it functioned as the cosmic axis that sustains and unites the fundamental forces of creation. The white hometry, that's described as a a radiant golden embryo floating in the primordial waters and containing within it the total potential of existence. Now, similarly, the white homa tree, located in the celestial sea, right, that offers healing and immortality to the gods. Now, these traditions reflect shared Indo-European belief in a divine essence that emerges from the void and gives form to the cosmos by structuring its forces through a central axis. Now, in Germanic cosmology, Mimersbrunner is what plays that role. Okay. Now, acting as the well of the inspired mind and memory and divine knowledge, but just as the white huma tree absorbed the essence of creation through its roots, so too does the golden seed in Riedberg's construction fall into Mimersbrunner, infusing Yggdrasil with the intelligence and the structure necessary to manifest an ordered universe. Now, this reconstruction is not only mythologically consistent, but it also aligns with quantum theory, which posits that creation emerges not from absolute nothingness, but from a quantum vacuum, a sea of latent energy that under the right conditions is organized into structured reality. So Yggdrasil's growth, therefore, was not merely an act of expansion, but the culmination of the organizing powers of Urdabrunner, Mimersbrunner, and Hvergelmir. So three divine reservoirs of fate, memory, vitality, and integrating Urlog, Ond, and Other into the very fabric of existence. So from the sacred branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree that is rooted in the divine wells and spans the entire cosmos, okay, from this tree comes a very special fruit, the Monometuther. Now, this compound does not appear directly in the surviving corpus, but it's also not a speculative invention either. But it is a theological reconstruction grounded in a tested poetic language. So let me explain. In Fjolfensmal 22, this fruit is described as Meith Munum Metoder, and that translates as fate measure among men. Now, the word Mjotuther shows up again in Waluspa 45, and in a line that means the measure tree is kindled. Okay, now earlier in that same poem, Yggdrasil is called the Mjotvith, or the glorious measure tree. Now, that's a poetic Haiti that's understood as the tree that meets out, that measures out, if you will, dispensing fate and divine law, Orlog. Now, because of these references, we can see that Yggdrasil and its fruit, the Mana Mututher, they act as the tools the universe uses to measure things out. Now, the first part of the word mana means of men. So the specific phrasing shows that the fruit is completely focused on human beings. Now, the fruit grows from divine godly roots, but its entire purpose is to finish building and completing the human person. And this makes it totally different from the magical fruits that you find in the other world myths, right? Like in other cultures, sacred fruits usually just represent general fertility, living forever or having lots of food. but the mana Mjotuther is not just a token of nourishment, and it is not a token of good luck, but how the different primordial elements are rendered spiritually coherent and bound to the structure of becoming, of Orlog. So think of the monometuther as the delivery vehicle. It's the way the sacred gifts of Oder and Und and Liturgotha are safely transmitted down into the human condition. It uses a precise and intentional measurement to perfectly align every person with the natural law of the cosmos, right? And this act of divine measurement is shown in the creation of Oscar Nimbla, which is described in the Waluspa poem. Now, these two human forms were shaped from logs of wood found on the seashore. Now, at first, they stood completely lifeless and incomplete. The lore says they were urlaglausa, which means they were without fate. They completely lacked odor, mind, owned, breath, law, blood, lati, manner, litrugotha, the inner hue. You know, their physical shapes were right there, but they were entirely unawakened. They had no breath, no thoughts, no physical vitality, no movement. There was no spiritual color, no fleshly color. And it was only when the gods stepped in that they were filled with the necessary elements for real consciousness, for personal identity and alignment with the divine order of the universe. Now, this holy pattern, it mirrors exactly what happens to an unborn baby. See, right after conception, the baby is biologically alive, but it is still spiritually unanchored. And it stays that way until it receives the cosmic measuring that tightly binds the quote unquote soul components to the physical body and then binds that physical body to its overall fate. And this binding is the exact job of the mana matuther. It serves as the sacred transmitter for the divine gifts, completely finalizing the process of soul integration. Now, the fruit of the world tree, Yggdrasil, it is called mana matuther when it's delivered down to mortals. But when it is used by the gods themselves, that's what we know of as Idun's apples. We can reconstructively call this God-focused version the Goda Matuther, using the word Goda to emphasize its role for the gods. Which is to fill the divine beings with their eternal youth and vitality. So if we know that those apples are the fruit of Yggdrasil, that Matuther, then it's the Goda, meaning the gods, the Goda Matuther. Now, these two fruits, the Mana Matuther and the Goda Matuther, they can be treated as the exact same thing in their physical substance and their source. Now, they're a sacred fruit grown directly from the branches of Yggdrasil, and they're deeply connected to the nourishment of the holy wells. But what makes their functions different is not what they look like, but how they are sanctified and what they're used for through the choices of the gods. So the apples of the Goda Matuther are not just randomly picked and eaten by the gods, and they go through a holy line of careful preparation. Now, in earlier times, they were shaken down from the world tree by the sons of the Alflar Jarl, Iwaldi. Then they were, prepared by the master craftsman Wayland, and then finally given to the goddess Idun, who would preserve and bless them for the gods to use. Now, this sacred line of craftsmanship was broken when Iwaldi died, and broken further when his son Wayland died. And that disrupted the ancestral chain of divine creation. But despite this massive disruption, Eden's role remained completely safe and unbroken. Even after those master craftsmen died, the gods still depend on her care.
because the apples only kept their special power when they were in her hands. She carried the blessing of the fruit forward, keeping the divine link alive that ensured the apples would keep working. For us, the monomatuther is also blessed, but its path is redirected toward the womb. As the poem Fjolsvindsmal 22 proves, this fruit is brought out for womb-sick women and is explicitly called a measurer among men. It goes to work inside the mother, integrating the different components of the soul and binding the unborn child to the ancient law of Orlog. Without this sacred measurement, the human being stays incomplete, a broken vessel, if you will. They might be alive biologically, but they're completely unordered. They might be moving, but they're not fixed to a destination. Measurement in this religious context is not about making a person's life longer. It's about giving that life a real metaphysical structure, a clear purpose, and a direct alignment with the divine law of the universe. To understand what's being measured and completed in a new life, we have to look at the elemental forces that are first set in motion at conception. Just like the divine interplay of Other and Owned animated the very first humans with consciousness and vitality, this exact same sacred synergy is reenacted in the biological union of the sperm and the egg.
Inside this comparison, the again, it's a comparison, mind you. In this comparison, the sperm can be compared to Other because it contributes the initiating structure to the development, including the centrosome needed for the very first cell divisions. In this limited sense, it represents direction, form, potential, structure that is waiting for animation. Now, on the other side, the egg can be compared to Owned because it acts as the vessel of vitality, encompassing the cytoplasmic matrix, the mitochondrial energy, and the biochemical architecture upon which life unfolds. Right. So without it, the encoded blueprint of the sperm remains completely inert and unanimated. Now, this biological union is not a mere matter of mechanics, okay? It's a tiny microcosmic reenactment of mythic becoming, thought meeting breath, spirit forming structure. And within this fusion, we witness the harmonization of the metaphysical with the biological. For the embryo only begins its journey once these principles coalesce. Yet, even this fusion, while foundational, is not enough by itself to complete a spiritual being. The child is alive and conscious in potential, but it is not yet spiritually integrated. Now, while Other provides the structuring impulse of thought and identity, and Own sustains breath and life, the emerging soul requires a third and deeper principle. It needs something that reflects not merely vitality or cognition, but an inward disposition and alignment with the cosmic law. And it is right here that Liturgotha enters. It doesn't enter as an external component delivered at fertilization, but as the spiritual hue that arises through the successful synthesis of breath and thought. Now, unlike Other and Owned, which in this model are imparted at the moment of soul giving, Liturgotha is given in potential. It only manifests through the spiritual blending of breath and thought, acting as a spiritual phenotype, if you will. The hue of moral patterning and the invisible signature of metaphysical alignment, right? So here, theoretically linked with Sogdalier as a realm of primeval formation, and with the physical nature of Lothar Wheely's gifts, Liturgotha expresses the innermost shape of the soul. It's what a person is before they act, beneath all outward form. So just like the physical phenotype arises from the interaction, between genetic code and cytoplasmic conditions, Litrogotha spiritually emerges from harmonization of Other and Owned. And this emergence, however, though, is not merely personal, but it reveals a deeper cosmological order into which the soul is woven. So as the soul's hue, meaning its internal spiritual balance or friction, Liturgotha expresses how a person's inner being has been shaped by their measured portion of Orlog. Orlog, the original law of becoming that rules over all unfolding events and binds everything in existence together. So this internal structure, whether it's perfectly harmonized or heavily strained, is not something a person earns by being good or bad. It's simply something measured directly into them. And the allotment given by Orlog is not always equal. Some people are gifted from birth with total clarity, while others are given internal, fragmentation where yet, every single person, though, is still completely bound and directed by Orlog. And what varies is the internal condition by which each individual soul carries that fate. It is an uneven measure that is shaped at the exact moment of soul weaving. Gofaganin discusses this directly. It notes that the Norns are not all of one single kind. Some of them are divine, some are elvish, some are daughters of the dwarf dwelling, because they come from different backgrounds and the fates they shape are highly uneven, leaving some human lives marked by ease and others marked by heavy hardship, but the soul's inner balance, which shows up in your Litrogotha, reflects this uneven shaping. Some people are crafted by good Norns, and their cosmic measurement results in ease, success, or great strength, right? But on the other hand, some people are formed by lesser or darker Norns, and causing them to carry a life fate that's rough or volatile or just difficult, right? But neither state lets you off the hook from Morlock, though, because both paths are woven directly into it. The only thing that changes is how well your soul fits the specific matching pattern that you were given, not the actual rules you have to follow. It's like, being handed a musical instrument. You don't get to choose whether you're given a violin, a guitar, or drums. That's decided for you. You're given it, but the only thing you can control is how you learn to play the instrument. And no matter what you're given, the only thing you can do is play by the rules before you. Yet, even once these higher soul components of thought, breath, and moral hue are fully shaped within the womb, they still remain unsealed. For the soul to be truly bound to its fate, the final act of divine measurement must be made. Now, even with all these pieces ready, the three-part setup of Other, mind, the owned, breath, and Liturgotha, inner hue, it stays hidden and quiet until it's locked into its proper measure. And this final act of putting the soul together is not biological, it's metaphysical. And it's a divine intervention from the gods that seal the whole structure into fate. And this sealing is done by the mana mitulur, the fruit of the world tree. It does not act as a source of life, but as a cosmic tool that calibrates personhood. Described in the lore as measure among men, this fruit is not just limited to one single biological moment. Now, Fjolsvinnsmal and the Volsunga saga connect it to conception, the time spent growing in the womb and birth, right? And its main job is always to serve as a measurer, binding the new person tightly to the cosmic law of Warlock. But in this view, a child's arrival is handled by the Norns. And Fabsmanal says that the Norns are helpful in need and choose mothers for children. So the fruit of the tree works under the measurement of Earth, that who is the premier Norn of fate and the ruler of hell, and she who fixes the laws of Orlog into the physical body. Now, in continuing this, Victor Reedbury, helped clear up why the god Hunir Way is called upon during this process. Now, he's um, called upon during this process, yes. So let's look into that. Now, uh, Victor Reedbury argued that the soul gifts given to the very first humans are repeated in every generation. And Hunir Wei stays continuously active, personally delivering Uther, the personal ego, the mind, to the developing baby inside the mother. And he pointed out that later folk traditions in Scandinavia and Germany kept a similar image alive. The famous story of a stork bringing little fruits of man from a magical pond to expectant mothers. And this legendary stork story is just a cultural echo of the ancient mythic pattern of a delivered soul rather than a literal explanation of biology. And Honir is known as like the long-legged bird god. A similar story, about a divine fruit, um, appears in the Wilsunga saga, and they had a king named River, and his wife. Him and his wife could not have children. Okay, so they prayed for an heir. Now, Woden heard their prayer, and the goddess Frigg sent a magical maid to drop a special apple into the king's lap. And he gave it to his queen to eat, and soon after, she became pregnant. So, you know, any specific timeline, okay, or exact step-by-step involvement by Earth, Hunir, or Frigg, we need to look at this as a teaching model. It's a framework to help us interpret these ideas. We need to be careful not to look at these things necessarily as a strict, rigid, step-by-step procedure. Because yeah, you can look at it chronologically, it progressing, linearly, if you will. Um, but when you're talking about the life of the child, and when is that exact, split second moment when that child becomes alive, from conception or after conception, be it still in the womb, that opens up a whole can of worms. And so the exact moment is definitely debatable. But me personally, I just say at conception. Now, because the main point is always the same. A divine act of the gods completes and seals what Orlog sets in motion and biology begins, right? What was just a living body, not, or a living, you know, um, as they say, fetus, it becomes a whole person in in the concept of fate, right? And that's how we should look at it. Life is life, and life is precious. All of our folk are precious. Now, the measured soul gifts of thought, breath and inner hue are aligned and sealed and woven into the child. The baby becomes not just alive, but a being with a destined path. And they are no longer Erlog Lausa. They're no longer without fate. And so therefore the mana Matuther is a real metaphysical binding agent, and it seals the new person to Orlog. And it turns unordered energy into an ordered and fated life, turning biological vitality into a spiritually anchored person. So So, just to summarize real quickly, the formation of the soul moves through four distinct stages. Odor initiates personal identity and mind. Owned animates physical life and breath. Litogotha expresses the inner moral hue. And Monomatuder binds them all together into with a cosmic purpose, all under the umbrella and direction of Orlok. Now, this divine measurement finalizes the spiritual building of the unborn child, but it also mirrors the judgment that happens after death at Earth's well, where the gods weigh all new and returning souls within the boundaries of their measured fates. The gods do not merely spark biological life, they fashion and complete it. And they do not fight against the natural order, but they work directly through it, shaping and fulfilling its deeper spiritual currents. Now, in this light, the soul is not a random, fleeting mystery. From the perspective of our daily lives, the soul is a multi-layered, harmonized system, and it begins with cells interacting in the womb, but it is made complete through ordered measurement. The integration of the soul reflects the natural order of everything in the universe because it's forged from the exact same ancient framework. It is shaped in the boundary conditions of the empty void, Gnungagat. It is bound tightly by the law of the universe, Orlog, and it is brought to life by the same colliding forces that birthed creation. You know, Physical life may begin at conception when the flesh is formed to prepare the way, but true personhood begins when the soul is measured and sealed by the gods. And whether that happens at conception, during development, or at the moment of birth, you know, but regardless, it's in that sacred moment when thought, breath, and your inner hue are bound to fate that a human being becomes fully integrated, and you are no longer merely a living, but you know you're aligned, you're awakened, and you're woven into the cosmic order. And it's through this sacred act that man is made not only to live, but to truly be. Okay, this is probably a good time to begin wrapping things up. Been going on for a while. Um, Now, okay, most of this episode, we've been discussing information, from my yet to be published upcoming Reconstructing the Germanic Soul paper, which delves, the paper will delve into a whole lot more details than I covered tonight. Uh, the more fleshed out thoughts, there'll be a lot more sources provided, and more of the soul's manifestation journey and journeys. Tonight, to be honest, I was giving a lot of detail, yes, but I was also giving an overview. Um, so look for the paper. It's going to be maybe the end of the year. I got to get through some things. A lot of irons in the fire, But I do want to give y'all a quick, exclusive look into that paper, just so you'll know a little bit more about, what it's gonna be in the paper, because we didn't get to dive into all of it on the show. But um, anyway, I just want to leave you with the teaser, of what's coming down the pipeline. So in the paper, I do a deep dive into how the soul, is an active moving force that expresses itself through dreams. I definitely get into dreams, the desires and the spiritual journeys of journeying, outside our physical bodies. I do explore how soul travel sends our inspired mind, our thought, and our emotional, memory and longing, our Huger and Muner outward into the world, in this traveling spirit, and how it's carried through the Filgia and can be made into an animal shape, and the fascinating part about that is, is the process of projection isn't just for trained, seers, sorcerers. You know it it, it happens to naturally to everyone through our dreams. you know the way that the Germanic ancestors saw things is that dreams were not just psychological illusions, just random entertainment popping up in your brain, but real metaphysical experiences where the soul's conscious awareness, travels outside the body to witness hidden realities or to glimpse fate or to receive powerful messages, you know, and these journeys can be wrapped in animal imagery, like a warrior dreaming of wolves or a blood-soaked goat before a battle. These are attested. Um, but actual literal extensions of the soul and the philia, sacred natural journey that's shared across the wider Indo-European tradition, you know, not just the Germanic folk, but other Indo-European peoples. Um, the I do in the paper I get into the soul's ultimate trajectory, and this is going to be actually something I'll get into on a future episode. Not sure which one, but it's going to be not too much longer from now. The afterlife. What happens to your soul? What happens to you when you leave the afterlife? What do the sources say? Everyone must eventually travel, the road to hell after death, um, and stand before the well of earth. And it's there that the gods sit as judges, where they'll weigh our thoughts and deeds and our spiritual hue, that litra gotha, and it'll be weighed against that unalterable law of Orlog to judge how truthfully we lived within our appointed fate. You know, but the soul, the cosmos, the soul it's not without danger. Because um, everything I've been talking about, I haven't really went into some of these things that could happen in the afterlife and the parts of the soul, and the paper does discuss some of these darker sides, like the dragger. While most souls do find rest, unresolved earthly trauma or a complete moral failure can completely disrupt that process of going into hell and having rest. And trapping a person's lower faculties within that decaying body as that dragger whose inner harmony is twisted into a curse. But on the flip side, we'll look at the circumstances where Orlog may grant a soul a rare measured reincarnation to fulfill its destined path across multiple lives. Um, but ultimately, what I want to show you in this paper is that the Germanic soul is not an accident. It's not a deliberate, or it is a deliberate combination of divine gifts measured into mankind from the very forces that ordered the cosmos, from birth to death, through life, dream projection, inheritance, and final judgment. The soul remains the thread that joins human existence to natural law, and it serves as a living bridge between the gods and men, calling us to live with the awareness that we are purposefully woven, measured from the beginning, and destined to return to the divine law of fate. But for now, I do believe we'll conclude this episode. I do appreciate those of you who stuck with it and gave it a listen. Um, much love. So we'll conclude this episode. Our task is simple. We meet life with courage, honor, and good intentions. And remember, weird bit full of red swaheo shall. Fate is fully fixed, and she goes ever as she shall. So until next time, stay strong, stay true, and hold fast to your faith, your kin, and your folk. Hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the ancestors, and hail the Frithstead. I'll see you on the next one. Have a good one.